If you're a guest here today, I am not Pastor Brian, so we're still glad you're here, and he would love to see you back next week. Pastor is actually doing a 20th pastoral anniversary for a dear friend of his, and as much as he wanted to be here, a 20th anniversary only comes around one time, and so he will be back next week, continuing the series, and he just wanted me to convey how much he loves you and is praying for you this morning. And, of course, we look forward to having him back next week. I want to ask you if you've enjoyed the Enemies of the Heart series. Yes? I've enjoyed it too. Every week, Pastor asks us questions. He says, who are you praying for to come to Christ? Who are you inviting to church? And who are you, even taking it a step further, who are you bringing to church? Well, what I want to tell you is that Pastor is actually going to extend this series. Next week, it was meant to end with the enemy of the heart of jealousy. He's actually going to come back the week after that with the enemy of the heart of pride. And does anybody know anybody with any pride? Anybody at all? Be careful who you look across at. He's going to do that. And the reason we want to do that is because we think this is such a powerful series, but we want you to combine who you're praying for, who you're inviting, and who you're bringing to this series. This is something, I mean, there are some things that sometimes we talk about that someone who's unchurched or doesn't know Christ may not know exactly, but everybody deals with anger and jealousy and guilt and pride and these things in our life. So take the time to pray and then extend your hand and invite somebody and bring them with you as Pastor finishes up this series over the next 2 weeks. You have to do that. If you're like me, this series has been pretty interesting because I walk in every week thinking, well, that's for somebody else. That's not really my thing. And then it's, by the end of the sermon, I'm thinking, well, that was only for me, and I'm the only one that deals with that. And maybe you're like me in that way. It was some time ago. I was driving home from work, and nothing unusual about my drive home, except for on this particular day, I was fighting some traffic, and somebody decided they wanted to see the interior of my car, but they wanted to remain in theirs. And so they were right on my bumper, and they just decided to stay on there. And if you're like me, you pray through. Does anybody have the prayer? Do you know the prayers when you drive? The first one starts with, God bless them. They just don't know what they're doing. Just help them today. And then as they stay on your bumper, it progresses to, Lord, protect us all with your grace and favor. And then as they stay on your bumper, it turns into, God, I'm being persecuted, and I want to know what's taking place right now. Why is this trial? And then it progresses as they get closer and closer to, Lord, protect them from me, because I'm about to send them to you. And then the last one is the one where you're biting your lip, you're grabbing the steering wheel, and you're saying, I bind Satan and the demon that's in that car. Under the blood of Jesus, I take authority. It's where you've totally forgot about driving, and you're just praying down their car, hellfire and everything. So you've done that. That's what it turned in for me today. But I took it a step further because without faith or without works, we need faith. And so I pulled into this light, and I could have turned, but it was turning yellow, and I didn't. And the guy that was looking at the interior of my car thought that I should have. And so he let me know that. I could see in the mirror that he was giving me direction and his horn and all that. And all of a sudden, I just snapped. I just snapped, and I put it in park. I opened my door, and in the middle of a 4-lane, I'm talking to him standing in the middle of this 4-lane. And of course, his eyes are this big. And the people around us are this big. And then before he could get out of the car or anything else, the light had changed and someone else let me know I needed to go. And so I got in the car and I left. And as the adrenaline was coming down, 2 questions came to my mind. The first one was, if he'd have gotten out, what was I actually going to do? It's all good and bad, but headline, local pastor beats the snot out of somebody in 4-lane. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do. But then as the adrenaline just released, all of a sudden, it just dawned on me, where did that come from? Where did that come from? I'll tell you where it comes from. It comes from your heart. You see, our words and actions and deeds are actually only just a gauge of what's really in our heart. And many of us have done regrettable things when it comes to anger. We've said things we wish we hadn't, and we've done things we wish we wouldn't have. We've all done that, but when it comes down to it, all the smoke and flames make us think it's about the anger, but I want to talk today about the heart behind it. You see, Proverbs 4 and Proverbs 4:23 tells us, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Everything. And that embarrassing thing that you did in the supermarket or in your office, that wasn't an exception to your heart. That was a reflection of your heart. That wasn't something that's just unusual. That's actually what was there. And the thing is that we don't realize that a lot because we're great at covering our hearts. We're terrific at it. We're taught from an early age, and we're just terrific at covering it. And what we say, when we say things that we wish we hadn't said, we just act like we don't mean it, but the truth is we just didn't mean to say it. Because in our heart, that stuff is still there. And we're taught from an early age as kids to hide that stuff. We shouldn't monitor our hearts. Instead, we monitor our behavior. And you remember what it's like. I mean, how many people, their mom washed their mouth out with soap? Everybody, okay, how many people were the bars of soap? Let me see the bars of soap people. Okay, how many were the liquid soap? The liquid soap. We got a few liquid soaps. I don't know which one's worse, but all I know is that when that happened to me, my mom wanted to correct what I said, and she wanted to make sure I never said it again, but she never addressed why it came out of my heart to begin with. So we're taught from an early age to just mind your manners and just act this way in public, but we never really dive into what is really in our hearts. You see, we reach for remedies for the symptoms instead of for the root of the problem. I mean, we're all taught how to deal with anger from counting and huffing and puffing, and some of these things are great, but that really is dealing with what? The symptom. It's not the root of the issue when it really comes down to it. And here's what I want to tell you, that eventually your ability to corral or create boundaries for your emotions, eventually your emotions are going to outpace you. And you can try as much as you want to keep them in check and keep them in check and keep them in check, but eventually, when you're in the forward lane, your emotions will outpace you. And all of a sudden, you're left wondering, where did this come from? Is that really on the inside of me? You see, an unchecked heart has the potential to ruin your life. It can erode your relationships. It can erode your character. It can erode your faith. There's so many things that it can destroy. And it's just this idea that it all comes from condition of your heart. As a matter of fact, if you're sitting here this morning and you say, I just haven't been able to sustain the relationships I want to, and I haven't been able to live a life and just reach the goals that I want to, I would say more than not, it comes back to a condition of the heart more than anything else. Generally, where we end up in life is less about our circumstances and more about where our heart is than anything else. You see, when a person discovers that they have physical heart disease, they don't really ask the questions of where did it come from and who caused this and when did it happen. What do they ask? They just ask, how can we fix it? They don't really settle on all these things, but when we have emotional heart disease, we ask, where did it come from and who caused it and when did it happen? And we never even ask, how do you fix it? We just concentrate on everything that got us to that point. We never even think about what will get us away from it. And so we have to today make sure that our hearts are pure before the Lord and that we're not carrying things that have been with us maybe for 10, 20, 30 years, or possibly carrying things today that will be with you 10, 20, 30 years from now. You have to make sure that at the heart of it all, you have a pure heart. You have to make sure that you don't pay attention to the anger and the guilt and the jealousy and the greed as all the things of why they happened and who caused them and when did they happen, but instead, how can we fix it? You see, anger is what we're going to focus in on today, and anger, probably more than any other, has the potential to be the most rawest, most powerful, damaging emotion that we have. And if you were a child and you grew up in a home that had an angry parent present, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It can be probably the most damaging emotion that we possess. 15 times in Scripture, the Bible pairs the word anger with fire. Anger with fire. And that's a great word picture for us to think of, because in the same way that fire has positive characteristics and negative characteristics, positive like hot water, you could look to the person beside you and say, I'm glad you have hot water. It has negative characteristics as well. Negative characteristics like that it causes forest fires and damages and houses and it burns us. Well, anger is the exact same way. We spend so much time concentrating on anger that we don't look at the real picture around it, which is that it can be positive or negative. Anger can actually propel us to do wonderful things that come directly from the heart of God. As a matter of fact, in Mark, Jesus actually heals a man out of anger. You can go and read that, how he actually heals a man out of anger because he's so mad at the religious people of the day that don't care about this person. But in the same way that it has positive characteristics, our anger has very negative characteristics that cause damage to us and especially to those who are around us. And Ephesians 4:26 says, be angry and sin not. You see, anger is not a sin. What you do with your anger is a sin. Okay? And here's one thing that you need to know about anger is it's a secondary emotion. It's caused by something. It's not the primary of what's taking place. And that's really hard for us to get because a lot of times we just pay attention to the kicking, screaming, snorting, spitting part of it. We don't ever think of why it's taking place behind, but it's really just a secondary emotion. Here's what you need to know about anger is that it loves to appear helpless. It loves to appear as though there's nothing it could have done to prevent what took place, and there's nothing that it could have controlled itself, and that it's nothing more than just a reaction that comes naturally. That's what anger loves for people to see. But unless we go down to anger at its source. I'm not talking about the gossipy coworker and the procrastinating spouse and the kid who won't pay attention. I'm not talking about any of that. I'm saying unless we look at the source of anger, you're never going to be free from it in your life. You're never going to see, because we can just pay attention to all the smokes and flames that takes place, but we never really pay attention to the actual cause of the fire of anger. You see, anger is a strong emotion of irritation, agitation that occurs when anger is not those emotions. Anger occurs when an expectation is not met. It occurs when an expectation is not met. I mean, think back to this. Anytime you've been ridiculously angry, you've been steaming angry. Think back to this. Some of you are thinking back to this morning. Okay? When you think to that, isn't it really boiled down to the simple statement that you didn't get what you wanted? Isn't that really true at its core? Is that, and ultimately you were angry because you didn't get what you wanted. And for the most part, sometimes what we want and what we deserve are valid points. Sometimes they are. You deserve to have safety and security and love and care and comfort. You deserve to have those things. But ultimately, when anger appears in our lives, it's just because we didn't get what we wanted. And we feel like that we should have got what we deserved. And so somebody owes us. Anger says, you owe me. It says you owe me. It says that I deserve because you took from me. You stole something that I expected or deserved in my life. And so therefore, you owe me. You owe me a marriage. You owe me a parent. You owe me a career path. You owe me all these different things that we end up angry about. But ultimately it comes down to, you owe me. See, anger creeps into our hearts when over a long period of time, these expectations are consistently not met. And many of us find that we stop being angry, we stop having moments of anger, and we start being angry. And it sticks with us longer than we wanted it to until 10, 20 years later, maybe 10 days later. You're still carrying this thing that was supposed to be meant for a moment, as the Bible tells us, to don't let the sun go down in your anger. Anger is acceptable in a moment. But the problem for us is we carry it for a lifetime. And so when our expectations aren't met, all of a sudden we become an angry person. And here's the problem. A heart filled with anger is a heart looking to be paid back. Unfortunately, and this is what I want to concentrate on today, most cases, the people who pay are the unsuspecting people in our lives, ourselves and those who are closest to us. Those are the people who pay the debt that's owed. It's very rare that the person who actually took something from us ever pay the debt to begin with. Most of the time, we just make everybody else pay. You see, anger creates this debt-to-debtor relationship. And if you've ever been in a relationship where you owed somebody money, even if it was a small amount of money or they owed you money, you know that is just something that's completely present, always in that relationship. Even right now, I'm thinking that I owe Pastor Curtis $8 for a movie ticket he bought me. Because that's money, that's a debt that's in our relationship. And you could think back right now, if I just gave you a moment, tell me somebody who owes you money that hasn't paid you back yet. Or tell somebody that you owe money that you haven't paid yet. It's always present in our minds. It governs the relationship. It makes the relationship 100% about that. And so when you're in a relationship where there's a debt and a debtor, there's only two things that can happen. Either they can pay up or you can cancel the debt. I mean, that's the only way, right? If there's a debt, you can only pay it up or it can be canceled. And see, it's easy to believe, and this is where we get stuck, it's easy to believe that the only way is for people to pay up. Because, I mean, people who take out debts deserve to pay those debts. And if we forgive a debt, then that means that the person that we forgave the debt to will probably run up a debt on another person. And so it's just not right that people don't pay their debts. You should have thought about it before you took out the loan. You should have thought about it before you took what you took from me. You should understand that you just have to pay that debt. I mean, that's where our hearts are at. That's what we think. We just think. But the problem with this is that this thinking is very tragic because people spend most of their lives waiting on debts that can't be paid. I mean, how's somebody going to pay you back a childhood? How's somebody going to pay you back a marriage? How's somebody going to pay you back a career path? And so here we're left with this anger and this debt and an inability to ever have it paid in full. You're probably saying at this moment, whoa, what happened to the funny story at the beginning? This got heavy pretty quick. And to be honest with you, I'm not comfortable with you presenting to me that you want me to consider my anger because you don't know what I've been through. You don't know who did it and what they did. I get that. I do. And I want to say first that I empathize with you. I am so sorry that whatever you're carrying happened. I'm so sorry that for some of you it was a marriage, and for some of you it was a debt that can't be paid, and for some of you it was an abuse that there's no way. And I'm so sorry that it happened. I really am. But what I have to ask you to consider today is that anger, that debt you're carrying may be affecting you more than you would believe. And that the debt you're expecting others to pay will end up costing you the most. And here's the question that every angry man and woman has to ask themselves. We all have to ask ourselves this. How long are you going to allow people who you don't like, who possibly aren't in your life anymore, who may not still be living, to control your life? How long are you going to let that happen? Because while you cannot undo what's been done, equally, you should not let your past control your future. And this is tough. Remember, your story explains your behavior, but it doesn't excuse it. It explains it, but it doesn't excuse it. If I do something to my son Sawyer, I can explain to him and give him context for what the hurt that I caused him. But you know in your heart, if you've ever had that happen, that won't excuse it. And so we're left with what to do. Well, luckily, the Bible has a lot to say about this. In Ephesians 4, verse 31, the Apostle Paul starts us out as he's writing to a church, much like ours. And he says, get rid of all bitterness, rage, anger, brawling, slander, along with every form of malice. Wow, Paul, you left a lot of room there, didn't you? You know what the Greek word for all is? All. It means all. Completely, all of it. And here's one of the crazy things about this is that for most of us, we're okay with some anger in our lives. We just think it's acceptable. I mean, honestly, we just think that that's just part of living life. You're just going to have some of it in your life. Paul says get rid of all of it. And then he continues down and he says, be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other. Well, Paul's never been on I-270. That's what we can determine from this point. Here's the deal. He says get rid of it all, and not only get rid of it, forgive them, be kind and compassionate. But here's the thing you have to know about this. Forgiving, the way Paul structures this sentence, is actually the way you get rid of it. It's like having to move a pile of dirt, and Paul says the only way to do that is with this wheelbarrow of forgiveness. Okay, he's saying that the only way you can move it is through forgiveness. So he's not saying, hey, you get rid of all that and then forgive. He's saying the only way you can get rid of all that is to forgive. And many of us to this point say, well, Paul, I'm sure that worked great 2,000 years ago, and you just didn't have going on, and Paul, you didn't have taken place, and blah, 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 blah. And so to this, Paul says this. He finishes verse 32. Forgiving each other just as in Christ God forgave you. Wow, well, that turns the tables, doesn't it? You see, here's the thing we do in life. We picture the whole scope and sequence of our life through our hurt. And when you do that, everything else seems smaller than your hurt. And so therefore, every conversation and every relationship and every decision seems smaller than your hurt. And you just don't understand why other people don't get that. And so what Paul's saying is simply that he doesn't want to negate that you were hurt, but he just needs you to flip your view that says that your hurt is not bigger than what Christ has had to forgive you for. What you're asking what we're saying you need to forgive from is not larger than what you've been forgiven of. So it's just a simple perspective change Paul's asking for in this moment. And we're just left with this idea of it doesn't make any sense. This kind of forgiveness doesn't make any sense unless you're a forgiven person. Forgiven people forgive, is what Paul's saying. So this just doesn't make any sense, Paul. Why would I forgive? Well, because you've been forgiven. And so maybe for some of you today, you've said, I've tried the forgiveness thing. I've read books. I've listened to sermons. I've tried it. It's not working. Maybe you haven't accepted forgiveness in your life. You can't. The term is just as. That means that it's just as Christ did it, meaning that without Christ, there's no just as. You can't forgive of your own strength. Forgiveness is not a natural thing. It is a supernatural thing. And so without Christ in your life, it is impossible to do it. But this didn't come just from Paul. This is not his philosophy. Paul learned this from one of his colleagues in the early church. He learned it from someone named Peter. And you can imagine Peter and Paul were sitting one day, and they were eating lunch, and they were talking about the things of the people they lead and what they struggle with. And Paul turns to Peter and says, Peter, I'm struggling because I have a church in Ephesus that really struggles to forgive. Did Jesus ever say anything about that? And Peter says, Paul, I'm glad you asked because I asked the exact same question some time ago. Let me tell you about it. And that's where we pick up in Matthew 18, verse 21. Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother and sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? Now, what you have to know here is that Peter has already explained forgiveness Jesus has already explained forgiveness to Peter one time. It was in Matthew chapter 6 on the Sermon on the Mount. And so Peter is coming back around and saying, Jesus, I know you talked about forgiveness, but can I get a little bit more narrow barriers on that? I mean, is it how many times? For what offenses? And he even anticipates Jesus' standard being higher. And so he says, I know we shouldn't forgive just once, because that's what Peter probably really thought in his heart, because that's what we think in our hearts. Well, I'll give you one time. What is it? One time, shame on you. Next time, shame on me, right? But he says, well, 7? And so what Peter is really asking at this moment is, when is enough enough? And when is enough enough? And this is the heart behind Peter, and I think it probably is relevant to us today. Peter assumed in this moment that forgiveness was for the benefit of the offender. He never considered that the forgiveness was of any benefit to of which himself, the offended. He never considers that. And so Jesus begins to tell a story. And he tells a story about a debt and money because he's trying to take the emotion out of it. If you've ever tried to talk to somebody about forgiveness and all the emotion clouds it, they can't see past that. So Jesus just says, let me tell you a story that doesn't include any of the emotion. And he says, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle his accounts with his servants. And as he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. And since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and children be sold to repay this debt. Now, 10,000 bags of gold is a hyperbole in this passage of Scripture, because in that day and time, it would have equaled billions of dollars. B with a B, billions, okay? And just to give you perspective, the county or region that this king lives in only collected 600 bags of gold for the whole city. So 10,000 bags of gold was just unbelievable. And so what we see is that this guy begins to have this huge debt that he could never repay. But notice, number one, how it affected those closest to him. Look at it. They were going to be sold into slavery. You see, anger affects those around us often way more than it ever affects us. You see, few of us ever have intended to hurt the people around us, but when we don't check our hearts and our uncontrolled anger, it's like letting a bomb off, and there's damage that follows. But here's what's worse is that in relationships, anger puts a ceiling on the potential of those relationships. If you show me an angry husband, I'll show you a wife who's a shell of a wife of who she should be because she governs who she is and puts away parts of who she is because of the anger of her husband. If you show me a passive-aggressive wife, I'll show you a husband who watches everything he says and watches everything he does because he has adjusted who he was meant to be because of the anger of someone else in his life. I mean, you may be an angry child here today. You grew up in an angry home. You know exactly what I'm talking about. That anger puts complete governors and ceilings on relationships that take place. But I want you to notice this too. If the man had sold his family and all of his possessions, it wouldn't have paid the amount owed. And what I would say to you is that if you got everything you wanted, the revenge, payback, whatever it is, it wouldn't pay it back. It'd still be there. How do you pay back a childhood? How do you pay back a marriage? Some of us are holding debts that can never be paid. I mean, we're asking for things to be done that really aren't going to fix it. And so he continues and he says, at this time the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything, even though knowing he couldn't. The servant's master took compassion on him and canceled the debt and let him go. Now, there's two things quickly I want to point out is that first, Jesus' definition of forgiveness is canceling a debt. But second is that word compassion. It's an odd word because it seems normal to us, but it only appears in certain terms in Scripture. It only appears tied to Jesus before he heals somebody. If you've ever read, Jesus had compassion upon them. That's the only time it ever appeals. So this king and Jesus are the only ones that ever share that description. Verse 28, but when the servant went out, he found his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins, not 10,000 bags of gold, 100 silver coins. And he grabbed him and he began to choke him. Aren't you glad that MasterCard doesn't treat you that way? Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, be patient with me, I'll pay you back. That should have rang a bell. But instead he refused, and he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. This man had been forgiven 600,000 times more than the debt he was trying to take. 600,000 times more. And at this point, the crowd that's listening to Jesus goes, how crazy is this? This is ridiculous. Does this guy not pay attention? Look how much he was forgiven and now what he's doing and asking for. And Jesus at that point goes, I've got you. He says, you're getting it. And he continues, he says, when the other servants had saw what had happened, they were outraged and went and told their master everything that had happened. And the master called the servant in. You wicked servant, he said, I canceled all the debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you? And in anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back what he's owed. Now, what I want you to see right here is that both of these guys are in prison. When you try to collect a debt on someone else, you put them in prison, but you also put yourself in prison. And when two people are in prison that owe each other, they can never pay each other back. So that by the very way that we put a person in prison and putting ourselves in prison, we are by ourselves dictating that what we want done can never be done. We're placing ourselves in bondage in the same way we're placing them in bondage, and two people in bondage could never meet the needs of each other. They could never meet those expectations. And so when you place yourself in this bitterness and this resentment, this prison that's in it, all of a sudden life just begins to seem heavy and life just seems darker. And if you've ever carried anger for any distance, you know that that's what it feels like. It just feels darker and heavier. It's because anger in multiple studies is tied to depression. When you choose to hold this debt over somebody, you're opening a door for depression to come in your life. It's the saying that says when you light anger is like lighting yourself on fire and expecting the other person to burn. You're hurting yourself by the way you're doing this. You're taking, because if you've ever been angry, you know that it distracts you. It distracts you. You can't even have your full mind. You're distracted. You can't focus. You can't concentrate. You're distracted. It also emotionally consumes you. You know what that means? That means that you can't share in moments of joy with other people because you're consumed by that emotion. You can't enjoy your kids. You can't enjoy your marriage. You can't take, because the only emotion you're using is anger, and there's no room for any other emotions to take place in your life. But some of you maybe say, I haven't enjoyed my life in a long time. It might be because you're using all your emotional equity on anger. But not only that, it tends to slight reality. Because then you look at every decision made by somebody else as they're picking sides. Or that they don't take what you said as true. And your relationships start to shift because they just don't get it. And all of a sudden, you find yourself in a prison. And you're not even the one that did anything. And so it's interesting because verse 35 comes. And up to this point, the crowd is nodding and saying, yeah, I'm with you, Jesus. That's the way it should be. Bless God. Verse 35 comes and it says, this is how your heavenly Father will treat you unless you forgive your brothers and sisters from your heart. And at that point, somebody in the crowd goes, that's right. What? What did he say? Bob, did you hear him say that if I don't forgive somebody that I won't be forgiven? Did you catch that? That's what he said. But the summary of this verse is this. If we continue to want to be paid back for the wrongs done to us, we will be the one who pays. And holding a debt may possibly be the most destructive thing you could ever do in your life. I mean, this man held a debt that ended up ending his life. He was put in prison for life because there's no way he could have ever paid back that sum. Holding a debt like this may be the most destructive thing you could ever do in your life. I mean, there are addictions and all those things, and we don't want to monitor on that, but this may be the worst of them all because you can't receive forgiveness that you desperately have to have. You see, forgiveness is a gift that ensures my freedom from prison, not the other person's freedom. It ensures my freedom. You see, you don't forgive people because they deserve it. You do it because you are undeserving. You don't forgive people because they deserve it. You forgive them because you've been forgiven. Our motivation is completely wrong because when you choose to hold unforgiveness over another person, you are choosing not to take it for yourself. It's the craziest thing you've ever heard. I want to talk to you about the road to forgiveness, though, because that's not easy either. You see, the road to forgiveness leads straight through your anger, not around it. See, we're comfortable with just, well, I'm just going to put that aside. Yeah, I forgive them. Notice Jesus said you had to forgive them from where? Your heart. It means it has to be real. It's not just lip service. You see, your road to forgiveness cannot go around your anger. It has to go straight through it. You have to admit you're angry. You have to know that it exists. You have to be willing to lay that aside. You just have to go through all the motions. There's no shortcuts on this road. Here's a couple things I want you to know quickly before, so that you don't discount what forgiveness is. Forgiving someone is not the same as condoning their offensive behavior. Forgiveness is not based on what's fair. Forgiveness is not being a weak martyr. And forgiveness is not letting the guilty off the hook. It's actually placing them on God's hook for him to execute his time. Here's 3 things you've got to do to be able to forgive. You have to decide to forgive. Here's why. Paul isn't talking about, forgiveness runs so contrary to who we are as a person and who we are. It's not natural. Remember, it's supernatural. That it's unlikely you will ever feel like forgiving anyone. And that's why in Scripture it is always described as a decision. It's not a feeling. It's not a song that Pastor Curtis will sing or a moment that I'll get you to your feet. It's a decision. You have to make a decision. And often people won't forgive because they don't feel like it. But forgiveness is not a feeling, it's a choice. And choices lead and feelings follow. If you live your life letting your feelings lead, your life is destined to end in destruction. But choices lead and feelings follow it. But then second, you've got to determine to forgive. You said, I thought I just decided. No, determination. Here's why. In the passage in Ephesians, Paul is not talking about a one-time transaction. He's talking about an attitude or a habit that actually takes place. A habit. You know why? Because as soon as you let yourself out of that prison, and you shut the door, your feelings will catch up to you, and they're going to tell you to go back in that prison. And so many people decide to forgive. They let themselves out the door. They shut the door behind them, and then they say, you know what? I'm still mad about it. I can't give it up. They did this to me, and they open the door, shut it right behind them again, and they're right back in the prison. That's exactly what happens. So you have to have a genuine determination for this to take place. You have to have, because your feelings will not automatically follow your decision to forgive somebody. And so you have to forgive, as Paul says, in an attitude. Every time it comes up, you have to say, God, I just rest in your forgiveness. I forgive that person. I release that debt. God, I give that over to you. It's not mine. And that's what it means to renew your mind. You're going to have to do that over and over and over again if you're determined to forgive. Finally, you have to give the gift. Now, a gift means you expect nothing in return. Right? See, Paul's language here, he could have used two different words in the Greek to describe forgiveness. He chose the one that meant forgiveness as though a gift. It's given to somebody. Here, take it. I don't expect anything in return. You don't have to pay anything back. You don't have to say anything. See, our version of forgiveness is, I'm forgiving you. Aren't you happy I'm forgiving you? Shouldn't you be saying something about me forgiving you? Isn't that how we do? That's not a gift. And so, it's a gift. It's given. You don't expect anything in return. You see, in the shadow of your hurt, forgiveness seems irrational. But in the shadow of the cross, it makes all the sense in the world. Because all of a sudden that perspective changes is that how much I have been forgiven to how much I am having to forgive. And I'm not trying to seem like something small in your life. I do empathize because some people in here today are dealing with things that are way bigger than just some trite little, somebody took your parking space. I realize that we're talking about real issues, but that does not make the grace and the freedom that you can achieve any less real. It doesn't make it any less real. So before you decide that you can never give a gift of forgiveness to someone, I want you to consider this. Some time ago, I fully experienced what we're talking about today. I found myself frustrated because there was a relationship in my life that just would not, it just didn't meet expectations. They promised things that didn't come through, and that they told me things would be different, and they weren't. And before it was said and done, I just found myself simmering over this. I would think about it constantly. And when I was with my kids, I was thinking about it. When I was with my wife, I was thinking about it. When I was in rooms like this, I was thinking about it. I prayed about it. And I decided that I got so frustrated with all the emotion of it all, because you know that there's an emotional roller coaster that comes with anger, is that I would actually write out exactly what this person had taken from me. And so I wrote it out, and I said, you know, that they owed me this, and they owed me this, and they said it was this, and that it affected this. And there was 5 things that they owed me. And I carried that list around in my phone in my pocket. And every time I would feel the emotion clouding, I would pick it up and I would say, here it is. And I thought that if I ever got the chance to confront that person, that I would read them the list. Because then the emotion, because, you know, there's nothing more frustrating than being angry and going to somebody and they're saying, you're just emotional. So I said, I'll take the emotion out. I'll give you exactly what you did. And I carried it around in my pocket, and it ended up in my prayer life a lot. And then one day I was walking, and I really felt like the Lord, he said, get your list out. So I picked up the list, and I started looking at it, and I felt like the Lord, without any further explanation from me, said, erase the list. And I said, God, what are you talking about, erase the list? This is what proves what was done. And he said, because I'm asking you to erase the list, it doesn't mean that it didn't happen. It doesn't mean that there wasn't hurt. It didn't mean that it didn't affect your family. It doesn't mean that it didn't hurt you, but I'm telling you to erase the list. And I pushed back one more time, and I thought, God, you just don't understand this list. And I felt like he stopped me in mid-sentence, and he said, if you keep lists on others, I will be forced to keep a list on you. And so it took everything I had, but I erased that list because I realized that it had everything to do with me. That person had no clue that list exists. That list bound me. It didn't bind them to anything. It bound me. And so I was left with this idea that when you cancel a debt or extend forgiveness, you set a prisoner free. But it turns out the prisoner was you. It wasn't the other person. You set a prisoner free. You see, the gift of forgiveness is much more for you than it ever is for the offender. It's always more for you because his ultimate forgiveness is going to come from Christ. For what they did, they'll have to answer to Christ. It'll have nothing to do with answering for you. And I know that there are people here today who say, that's too hard. And I specifically heard the Lord say to me about this service today that there are people here who doubt that they could ever be free from the anger that they have. Because it's almost just because it's become a part of you. You assume that you were just born with it, or that people who go through what I go through, they just live with this. And that's just a lie from the enemy. You can be as free as anyone else. You can have a full life of joy and peace and the grace extended in your life. You don't have to have any of that in your life. That is a lie from the enemy that you've been believing for a long time. And it is hard to forgive people. As Pastor Curtis and them come, it is hard. But I want to tell you, the reason that God asks us to do hard things is because they require faith. And that's the currency or the fuel that our relationship to Him runs on. And it requires faith. But on the other side of any time you have to take a step of faith, it will all make sense. It may seem confusing on this side, but on the other side of that step, it always makes sense. Stand to your feet this morning.